At St. Mary's General Hospital, a prestigious institution nestled within an affluent suburban community, the halls gleam with an air of professionalism and excellence. However, beneath its polished exterior lies a hidden undercurrent of tension, a culture of exclusion, and deep-seated prejudices that have long festered in the shadows. Angela Parker, an ambitious and talented black nurse, arrives at the hospital with hopes of making a positive difference. Little does she know, the challenge she is about to face is not just a personal struggle, but one that will ignite a catalyst for change within the very foundations of the hospital. As Angela navigates her new role, she finds herself battling discrimination from both colleagues and patients, while one unexpected patient, Thomas Edwards, quietly observes the unfolding turmoil. His presence will not only alter the course of Angela's career but also set in motion a transformation that will challenge the hospital's toxic culture, expose its long-hidden biases, and reshape its future forever. This is a story of resilience, the fight for justice, and the power of one voice to spark systemic change. The arrival of Angela Parker at St. Mary's General Hospital. Angela Parker stood at the entrance of St. Mary's General Hospital, a place renowned for its state-of-the-art medical facilities and a legacy of excellence in patient care. As the doors opened, she stepped inside with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, the weight of the moment not lost on her. She had worked tirelessly to earn her place here. Her journey, which had started with long nights of studying, grueling exams, and overcoming the doubts of professors and classmates, had finally led her to this prestigious institution. Angela had always known that being a black woman in healthcare would require resilience, but she had hoped that here, in this esteemed hospital, the emphasis would be placed on her skills rather than the color of her skin. The air inside the hospital was antiseptic and sterile, thick with the scent of disinfectant, masking the subtle tension that hung in the air. The walls, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, seemed to radiate an air of professionalism. But as Angela made her way through the pristine halls, a sense of unease began to settle in. It was almost as if she could feel the undercurrents of something unspoken, watching her, waiting to see how she would fit into the tight-knit, homogeneous world that was St. Mary's. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, reminding herself of why she was here. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "Baby girl, you come from a long line of strong women. You've got that same strength in you, don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Angela pushed the knot of nervousness in her stomach aside and walked with determination toward the nurse's station. She had made it this far, and nothing, not the whispers or the side glances, would deter her from proving herself. As she approached the nurse's station, she immediately felt the change in the atmosphere. Conversations, which had been flowing a moment ago, suddenly halted. She could sense the eyes of the nurses turning toward her, some hesitant, others unsure, and a few openly dismissive. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Angela could feel the weight of their gazes on her back. They were sizing her up, and it was clear that she was an anomaly in their world. Angela swallowed hard, refusing to let the feeling of isolation consume her. She was here for a reason, and she would prove herself, no matter the obstacles. She cleared her throat and addressed the blonde nurse at the station, whose eyes widened ever so slightly before she masked her surprise with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me, I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could you direct me to the head nurse's office?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The nurse's smile was polite, but it lacked warmth. "Of course," she said coolly. "Down the hall, third door on the right." Angela nodded her thanks and walked down the long corridor, acutely aware of the silence that seemed to follow her, punctuated only by the soft click of her sensible shoes against the tile floor. Each step felt like an echo in the stillness, magnified by the quiet of the hospital that seemed almost too perfect to be real. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting to see if she would stumble. But Angela refused to let her nerves get the best of her. She was determined to make it through the day. As she neared the head nurse's office, she was stopped by a tall, distinguished-looking man in a white coat. His salt-and-pepper hair and authoritative stance made it clear that he was a senior doctor, a man of high rank within the hospital. Angela's heart skipped a beat. Perhaps this was her chance to make a positive first impression. Maybe he could be an ally, a person who would understand the challenges she faced and help her navigate this new environment. "Good morning, Doctor," Angela greeted, offering a warm, professional smile. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse starting today. It's a pleasure to meet you." The doctor's steel-grey eyes scanned her with an almost clinical detachment. He didn't return the smile. "Dr. William Greaves," he replied curtly. "I trust you've been properly oriented to our protocols." Angela hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Yes, Dr. Greaves, I've reviewed the materials." He didn't seem interested in her answer. "We maintain very high standards here at St. Mary's," he said, his tone cold and dismissive. "I hope you're prepared to meet them." Without waiting for a response, he brushed past her with barely a glance. Angela stood frozen for a moment, her hand still outstretched as if expecting him to shake it. But he was already gone, disappearing down the hall as quickly as he had appeared. His abrupt departure left her feeling deflated, as though the wind had been knocked out of her. She swallowed the sting of disappointment and allowed her hand to fall to her side, but she refused to let it show. Refusing to let one brief encounter derail her, Angela took a deep breath and steadied herself. She knocked on the head nurse's door, her mind racing. As the door creaked open, she was met with the stern gaze of a middle-aged woman, whose expression gave nothing away. "Miss Parker, I presume," the head nurse said, her tone clipped and unwelcoming. "Come in. We have a lot to cover, and I expect you to keep up." Angela stepped into the office, her nerves fraying as she tried to shake off the cold reception she had already received. But as she followed the head nurse into the sterile office, Angela's mind wandered back to her earlier days spent in nursing school where every step had felt like an uphill battle. She remembered the long nights of studying, the extra hours in the lab, the subtle dismissals from professors who questioned whether she truly belonged. And yet, through it all, Angela had persevered. She had graduated at the top of her class, her determination and skill silencing even her harshest critics. Now, standing at the threshold of her career, Angela felt a familiar sense of isolation creeping in. It wasn't just the hospital that felt foreign, it was the culture, the attitudes, the unspoken rules that seemed to dictate who belonged and who didn't. She had fought too hard to let that stop her now. The day ahead would be long, and it would be hard, but Angela knew that this was only the beginning. The real battle was just starting, and she was determined to be a part of the change that was long overdue. Little did she know that this very moment would mark the start of a transformation that would challenge the hospital's deeply ingrained prejudices and set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the course of her life. The first day and isolation at St. Mary's. Angela's first day at St. Mary's General Hospital was a blur of orientations, introductions, and paperwork. It was an overwhelming rush of information, all of it designed to help her settle into her new role. Yet, amid all the bustle, there was an undeniable undercurrent of tension that seemed to follow Angela wherever she went. It wasn't the usual first-day nerves that she was experiencing, but rather something deeper, something that she couldn't quite place, but that weighed heavily on her spirit. As she made her way through the hospital, she couldn't ignore the subtle ways in which she was excluded. Conversations would quiet when she entered a room, and when she tried to engage with her fellow nurses, her attempts were met with polite but distant responses. The coldness was palpable, and Angela couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence. She was different in this space, marked by her skin color, by her presence in a system that had been built around a very particular image of who belonged and who didn't. She wasn't just the new nurse. She was the new black nurse in an institution that had long been a bastion of exclusivity, one where diversity felt like an afterthought rather than a reality. Despite her best efforts to blend in, Angela stood out. And not in a way that made her feel welcome. She had walked into St. Mary's with a sense of purpose, with the belief that if she could just show her competence, she would be accepted and valued for her skills. But now, as the day wore on, it became clearer that her ability to simply be would be questioned at every turn. At the nurses' station, Angela could see that she was the subject of hushed whispers. Nurses would glance at her, exchange knowing looks, and then quickly avert their eyes. They spoke in clipped tones, always polite but never engaging. It wasn't overt hostility, but it was enough to make Angela feel like an outsider, a person who wasn't meant to be there, no matter how capable she might be. Her efforts at small talk, asking about shifts or patient protocols, were met with curt, perfunctory replies that lacked warmth or genuine engagement. By lunchtime, the isolation was beginning to take its toll. Angela found herself sitting alone in the break room, her meal untouched as her mind wandered. She had known that being a nurse of color would bring challenges. She had seen it in nursing school, in the dismissive looks from certain professors, the questioning stares from classmates. But she hadn't expected it to be so pronounced here, in a hospital that prided itself on its excellence and its patient care. She hadn't anticipated feeling like she had to prove herself not just to the patients, but to her colleagues, day in and day out. The hum of idle chatter around her only amplified the silence she felt within. Her colleagues spoke amongst themselves, laughing and exchanging stories as if she were invisible. She tried not to take it personally, reminding herself that it was probably just the first-day jitters. After all, she had been the new nurse plenty of times before, and eventually, she had always found her place. But something about the way the staff here interacted with her felt different. It wasn't just the aloofness, it was the subtle, almost unspoken sense of being unwelcome. The true extent of the division became apparent as Angela overheard two nurses talking around the corner. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their conversation was loud enough for her to catch every word. "Did you see the new hire?" one whispered, her voice dripping with disdain. "Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking," the other replied. "This isn't exactly the neighborhood for, you know." The words hung in the air, the implication clear. Angela didn't belong. Not in their hospital, not in their world. Angela's heart sank as the weight of the reality she had been trying to ignore crashed over her. This wasn't just a new job. It wasn't just a matter of fitting in with new colleagues. This was a battle against a culture that had long been exclusionary, one that made assumptions based on the color of her skin rather than her abilities. She had hoped that the cool reception was simply due to first-day nerves, but the whispered conversation made it clear that her struggles were just beginning. She had hoped for a fresh start, a place where her hard work and dedication would be recognized. Instead, she was already facing the harsh reality of what it meant to be a black woman in a predominantly white, prestigious institution. The hurt and anger that flared within her was swiftly suppressed as Angela realized that the only way forward was to continue with her mission, to prove her worth, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way. With her mind swirling, Angela decided to take a break outside, to clear her head. The cold air was a welcome respite from the sterile walls of the hospital. She stood by the bus stop, staring off into the distance as she tried to process everything. The exhaustion from the day's events was beginning to set in. But even as she fought the urge to crumble under the pressure, her mother's voice rang in her ears once again. "Don't you dare let them see you falter." Angela pulled out her phone and dialed her mother's number, needing to hear that familiar voice. After 2 rings, a soft, comforting voice answered on the other end of the line. "Hey, baby girl. How was your first day?" her mother asked. Angela's throat tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The tears that had been threatening all day finally pushed to the surface, but she fought them back. "It was challenging, Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't expect it to be this hard." There was a pause on the other end of the line before her mother spoke, her voice filled with strength and understanding. "Angela Marie Parker, you listen to me," her mother said, firm but loving. "You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember who you are, where you come from. You're not just there for yourself, you're there for every little black girl who dreams of being in those halls one day." Angela closed her eyes, absorbing her mother's words. The weight of the day, the isolation, the rejection, it all seemed to melt away, replaced by a quiet but powerful resolve. She would not give up. She would fight back, just as she had done in the past. "I know, Mama," Angela replied, her voice steadier now. "I won't let them break me." The call ended, and Angela felt a renewed sense of determination surge through her. As she looked up, she saw the sleek black Mercedes pass by. Through the tinted windows, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves, who made brief eye contact with her before the car sped away. There was no warmth in his gaze, just a fleeting look of indifference. But Angela stood straighter, her shoulders squared, the words from her mother still echoing in her mind. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone, define her. With the strength of her family behind her, Angela knew that she could weather whatever challenges St. Mary's threw her way. Little did she know, her presence at the hospital would soon set in motion a series of events that would challenge the very foundation of St. Mary's General Hospital, exposing the toxic culture and long-held prejudices that lurked behind its prestigious facade. A personal conversation with her mother and a silent resolve. Angela's phone call with her mother was a lifeline, a beacon of hope that cut through the fog of isolation she felt at St. Mary's. As the night descended, she sat alone on the hard plastic bench at the bus stop, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had come to this place hoping for a fresh start, a place where her abilities would shine, but it seemed that the shadows of prejudice were already threatening to obscure her light. The cold wind stung her skin, but it couldn't match the chill inside her chest, the gnawing feeling of rejection and doubt that had settled in. When her mother's voice came through the phone, it was like a warm embrace across the miles. "Hey, baby girl. How was your first day?" Her mother's voice was filled with the kind of comforting warmth that Angela had missed ever since she left home. Angela had always known her mother to be a source of strength, someone who had taught her from a young age that no matter what life threw at her, she could handle it. But today, Angela wasn't so sure. "It was challenging, Mama," Angela said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been trying to push down the rising tide of frustration all day, but now, as she spoke to her mother, the weight of everything seemed to crash over her. "I didn't expect it to be this hard." On the other end of the line, her mother's response was immediate, filled with the kind of understanding that only a mother could provide. There was no judgment, only love and strength. "Angela Marie Parker, You listen to me, her mother said, her tone firm but gentle. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. You come from a long line of strong women, and you've got that same strength in you. Don't you dare let them see you falter. Remember, you're not just there for yourself. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of being in those halls one day. Angela closed her eyes as her mother's words sank in. She could hear the pride in her mother's voice, the quiet confidence that had been passed down through generations. In that moment, Angela remembered the late-night study sessions, the extra hours she had put in, and the sacrifices her mother had made to ensure she could pursue her dreams. She thought about the times in nursing school when people had doubted her abilities, when professors had raised eyebrows at her success, when classmates had whispered behind her back. But she had persevered through all of it, silencing the critics with her excellence. She wasn't going to let a handful of strangers in a hospital tear her down. Her mother's words gave her a renewed sense of purpose. I know, Mama, Angela replied, her voice now steadier. I won't let them break me. The bus stop felt less cold now, as if the warmth of her mother's encouragement had wrapped around her like a protective shield. She sat up straighter, lifting her chin and squaring her shoulders. For the first time since she had walked through the doors of St. Mary's, she felt like herself again. Angela Parker wasn't just a nurse, she was a woman with a legacy of strength behind her, and no amount of prejudice or rejection was going to stop her from succeeding. As Angela sat on the bench, staring into the distance, she heard the familiar sound of a sleek black car approaching. Her heart skipped a beat as the car slowed down and came to a stop just a few feet away. Through the tinted windows, she saw Dr. Greaves, the senior doctor who had brushed past her earlier in the day with nothing but disdain. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and there was something about the look he gave her, cold, dismissive, that made Angela's stomach churn. But she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She held his gaze, her chin lifted with the quiet defiance that her mother had instilled in her. The car sped away, and Angela was left standing there, her thoughts swirling once again. But this time, she didn't feel the same sense of uncertainty that had plagued her earlier in the day. She had been tested already, by the cold reception of her colleagues, by the subtle exclusions, by Dr. Greaves' condescension, and yet, she had survived. She was still standing. As she stood up to catch her bus, Angela realized that, though the road ahead would be difficult, she was ready for whatever came next. The weight of the day still pressed down on her shoulders, but now, it felt like a challenge she could face head-on. She was not alone in this fight. Her mother's words, her family's strength, and the resilience of generations past were with her every step of the way. She wasn't just here to be a nurse, she was here to make a difference, to challenge the culture of St. Mary's, and to prove to everyone, including herself, that she belonged. The bus pulled up, and as Angela stepped on, she felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over her. The hospital had no idea what was coming. She was ready to change things. She was ready to fight for herself, for the little black girls who dreamed of standing in those halls one day, and for every nurse who had ever been overlooked or underestimated because of who they were. Dr. Greaves' undermining behavior and rising tension. As the days passed, the hospital's cold and unwelcoming atmosphere continued to weigh heavily on Angela. She had braced herself for challenges, but the way her colleagues treated her was more than just a mild inconvenience, it was a constant reminder of the systemic prejudice that persisted beneath the hospital's prestigious exterior. It wasn't just that people ignored her or kept their distance, there was an underlying hostility in the way they interacted with her. From whispered conversations to dismissive glances, Angela quickly realized that her skills and qualifications weren't enough to overcome the barriers that had been set long before she arrived. But if there was one person who epitomized the condescension and prejudice she faced, it was Dr. William Greaves. The senior doctor's behavior toward Angela had been nothing short of undermining from the moment they had first met. He seemed to take a particular pleasure in finding faults with her work, no matter how well she performed her duties. Dr. Greaves had been one of the first people Angela encountered when she started at St. Mary's, and his initial coldness had been a harbinger of the challenges to come. One morning, as Angela was going over patient charts at the nurse's station, she felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders. She had grown used to the feeling of eyes on her, eyes that followed her every move with a mix of suspicion and disdain, but today it felt different. Dr. Greaves approached the nurse's station, his face a mask of detached authority. The bustling noise of the nurse's station seemed to fade as he drew nearer, and even the air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if anticipating what was to come. "Nurse Parker," Dr. Greaves called, his voice carrying across the busy station. The way he said her name, laced with disapproval, sent a chill down her spine. "I hope you've familiarized yourself with our protocols by now. We can't afford any mistakes." Angela didn't flinch at the challenge in his tone, but inside, She could feel the familiar knot of frustration tightening in her chest. She had been at St. Mary's long enough to know that she was being tested, that no matter how meticulously she followed the protocols, Dr. Greaves would find something to criticize. It wasn't about her performance, it was about proving her worth in a place that seemed determined to see her fail. "I've reviewed all of the procedures, Dr. Greaves," Angela said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. "I'm prepared." Dr. Greaves raised an eyebrow, his expression almost imperceptibly condescending. "I'll see about that, won't we?" he said, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Let's hope you've learned everything you need to hear." His words stung, and Angela couldn't suppress the feeling that he was setting her up for failure, waiting for her to slip up so he could pounce on the smallest mistake. There was something almost malicious in the way he scrutinized her, as if every action she took was under the microscope. It was a familiar feeling, one she had experienced countless times before, when others doubted her simply because of who she was. But this time, Angela refused to let it get to her. She had been tested before, and she had always come out stronger on the other side. Throughout the day, Angela found herself on the receiving end of more subtle yet insidious forms of exclusion. The tasks she was assigned were always the most challenging and least desirable: patients who required constant attention, complex procedures, and individuals who were difficult to manage. While her white colleagues were assigned relatively straightforward cases, Angela was left to handle the most difficult patients, and in doing so, she was forced to prove herself over and over again. It wasn't lost on Angela that these assignments seemed more like tests than actual responsibilities. She was being given the hardest cases, and even when she succeeded, her accomplishments were either ignored or dismissed. She knew that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how skilled she proved herself to be, it would never be enough in the eyes of those who had already decided she didn't belong. One such test came in the form of Mr. Johnson, a patient known for his racist outbursts. When Angela was assigned to care for him, she knew exactly what to expect. Mr. Johnson had already driven 2 nurses to tears that week, and Angela could sense that this assignment was yet another challenge designed to test her resolve. The whispers from the other nurses made it clear that they expected Angela to fail. They were watching, waiting for her to crumble under the pressure. Angela walked into Mr. Johnson's room, her heart racing in anticipation of the verbal abuse that would inevitably follow. As soon as he saw her, Mr. Johnson's face twisted into a scowl. "What are you doing here?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I told them I don't want no colored nurse touching me." The word stung, and Angela felt a surge of anger rise within her. But she knew better than to let it show. She had been here before, she had faced worse, and she had always held her head high. "I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing," Angela said, her voice calm and professional. "I assure you, I'm more than qualified to provide you with the care you need." Mr. Johnson didn't respond to her words, but he didn't need to. The torrent of racial slurs and insults that followed spoke volumes. He hurled one insult after another, trying to provoke her, trying to break her. But Angela stood her ground, refusing to let his hatred affect her professionalism. She completed her tasks with the precision and care she knew she was capable of, her focus unwavering despite the barrage of abuse. When she finally left the room, she felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. She had done it. She had faced down Mr. Johnson's bigotry with nothing more than her composure and her skill, refusing to let his prejudice derail her. But as she stepped into the hallway, she was met with another test. Dr. Greaves was waiting for her, his face a picture of feigned concern. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Parker?" he asked, his tone laced with barely disguised sarcasm. "We heard quite a commotion." Angela met his gaze evenly, not letting the mockery in his voice rattle her. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed," she said calmly. "Is there anything else you need from me, Dr. Greaves?" For a moment, surprise flickered across Dr. Greaves' face before it was replaced by his usual mask of condescension. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "let's hope you can maintain that level of composure with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints, now would we?" The implication hung in the air, thick with judgment. It wasn't about her professionalism, it was about whether or not she would give them the satisfaction of proving their prejudices right. But Angela didn't flinch. She had been tested and she had passed. As the day wore on, Angela's patience was tested further. Her colleagues continued to look the other way, pretending to be busy when she entered the room, as if she didn't exist. Even as she worked tirelessly through the day, completing one difficult task after another, there was a constant reminder that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. She was being watched, scrutinized, judged, not for her abilities, but for the simple fact that she was a black woman in a predominantly white institution. The weight of the scrutiny was exhausting. But Angela had made up her mind. She would rise above it. She would show them all that she was more than their narrow-minded expectations. She would succeed not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Mr. Johnson's abuse and Angela's unwavering professionalism. The day Angela was assigned to care for Mr. Johnson, she had a sinking feeling that this would be yet another test, one designed to push her to her limits. Mr. Johnson was a patient who had earned a reputation in the hospital for his volatile and racist behavior. He had already driven 2 nurses to tears that week with his cruel outbursts and insulting remarks. As much as Angela wanted to avoid him, she knew that this was part of the job. She had to face him head-on, not just as a nurse but as a black woman in a system that constantly demanded more from her. When Angela entered Mr. Johnson's room, she was greeted by the sight of him sitting up in bed, his eyes narrowing as he saw her walk through the door. The room felt heavy with tension, as though the very air around her was thick with hostility. As she approached his bedside, she braced herself for the onslaught of slurs she knew would soon follow. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Johnson spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I told them I don't want no colored nurse touching me." Angela's stomach churned at the words, but she refused to let his hatred shake her. She had faced worse in her life and in her career, and she wasn't about to let one man's prejudice break her. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, her professional demeanor never faltering. "I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing," Angela said, her voice steady. She stood tall, facing him with a quiet strength. "I'm more than qualified to provide the care you need." Her words seemed to have no effect on him. Mr. Johnson began to shout and curse, hurling racial slurs at her, attempting to provoke her into a reaction. But Angela knew better than to respond in kind. Her job was to care for him, and that's what she would do, regardless of the abuse he threw her way. As she worked, changing his dressing and monitoring his vitals, Angela was forced to endure a constant barrage of insults. Each slur felt like a slap to her face, each word designed to undermine her sense of worth, to make her feel small, to remind her that she didn't belong. But Angela remained calm, her hands steady as she completed her tasks with the precision she was known for. The anger and frustration bubbled inside her, but she didn't let it show. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Every so often, she would steal a glance at Mr. Johnson's face, which was twisted with rage. His eyes were filled with disdain, but Angela refused to let his hatred affect her. She focused on her work, on the vitals she needed to monitor, the bandages she needed to change. She reminded herself that this was her job, not just to care for the patients, but to rise above the challenges, to show that she was capable, no matter the prejudice that came her way. The task seemed to drag on, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. Angela could feel her patience wearing thin, but she kept her emotions in check. As much as she wanted to yell, to fight back, she knew that wouldn't solve anything. She couldn't let herself become the angry black woman they expected her to be. She had to be better than that. When she finished, she stood up and straightened her back. She had done it. Despite the abuse, despite the hatred, she had completed the task with professionalism and grace. She had risen above the racial slurs and insults, refusing to let them define her. She had shown Mr. Johnson that she would not be broken. As she left the room, feeling the weight of the day's events settle over her, she found Dr. Greaves waiting for her in the hallway. The look on his face was one of feigned concern, but Angela could see the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. He had been watching, waiting for her to slip up. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Parker?" Dr. Greaves asked, his voice dripping with insincerity. "We heard quite a commotion." Angela met his gaze steadily, refusing to let the mockery in his voice get to her. She was done letting him have any power over her. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. "Is there anything else you need from me, Dr. Greaves?" For a moment, there was silence. Dr. Greaves' eyes narrowed as he studied her, clearly not expecting her to be so composed. But Angela held her ground, refusing to show any sign of weakness. Finally, after a long pause, Dr. Greaves let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh, his mask of concern slipping for just a moment. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "let's hope you can maintain that level of composure with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints, now would we?" The implied threat in his words was clear. No matter how well she did, Dr. Greaves was always looking for a reason to tear her down, to remind her that she was not welcome in this space. But Angela didn't flinch. She had already proved herself in Mr. Johnson's room. She had faced his abuse with professionalism, and she would do the same with every other challenge that came her way. As Angela made her way through the halls, she could feel the weight of her colleagues' stares following her. Their judgments were never voiced directly, but she could feel them, like an invisible weight pressing down on her. They were waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to make a mistake. But Angela refused to give them the satisfaction. She was here to prove that she belonged, and no amount of prejudice would stop her from doing so. The rest of the day was a blur of difficult tasks and subtle slights. She was assigned to the hardest cases, the ones that no one else wanted to deal with. She worked tirelessly, her mind focused on the patients she was there to care for, the work she was there to do. But even as she pushed herself to the limit, she couldn't shake the feeling that every mistake, every misstep, would be magnified. Every flaw would be scrutinized, every failure highlighted. Angela's exhaustion began to take its toll, both physically and emotionally. But she refused to let it show. She would finish her shift and walk out of the hospital with her head held high. She wasn't going to let them break her. Not now, not ever. The mysterious Mr. Edwards and a glimmer of hope. Angela had already endured so much in her first few weeks at St. Mary's, constant scrutiny, subtle exclusion, and open prejudice from colleagues. Yet, amid the ongoing struggles, something unexpected happened. She was assigned to care for a new patient, Mr. Thomas Edwards, a man who, on the surface, seemed like just another VIP patient receiving treatment at the hospital. But as Angela entered his room for the first time, something about him felt different. There was an air of quiet authority about him, a sense that he was not just another patient, but someone who had a presence that commanded respect. Mr. Edwards had been admitted after a skiing accident that left him with both arms in casts, but despite his injuries, there was a calmness about him that intrigued Angela. As she entered the room, he looked up at her with sharp, assessing eyes. Unlike most of the patients Angela had cared for, there was no trace of prejudice in Mr. Edwards' gaze. He did not look at her with suspicion or disdain, as others often did. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her, as if he was seeing her for who she was, not just as a nurse but as a person with her own unique story and strength. "Good morning, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards greeted her with a warm smile. His voice, though slightly strained from his injuries, was steady and strong. "I appreciate your help. I must say, I didn't expect to end up here after my skiing accident." Angela smiled back, surprised by the kindness in his tone. She had gotten used to being treated with indifference, or worse, by patients who felt uncomfortable with her race. But Mr. Edwards' demeanor was different. There was no judgment, no sense of superiority, only genuine respect. It was a small but significant moment, one that Angela clung to as a reminder that not everyone saw her through the same lens of prejudice. "Of course, Mr. Edwards," Angela replied, trying to keep her voice professional but noticing the unexpected sense of ease that she felt around him. "I'll take good care of you. Let me check your vitals and adjust your four." As Angela moved about the room, performing her duties, she couldn't help but notice how Mr. Edwards watched her every move. His gaze was not one of scrutiny, but of genuine interest, an interest that felt like a breath of fresh air in the otherwise tense atmosphere of St. Mary's. For the first time in days, Angela found herself feeling seen and respected for her abilities, rather than being reduced to her skin color or gender. There was something about Mr. Edwards' quiet observation that made her feel as though he understood the weight she had been carrying. "You seem very competent, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said as she adjusted his four. "How long have you been working at St. Mary's?" Angela paused for a moment, surprised by the question. Most patients never asked about her background. They were too focused on their own care to consider the person providing it. But Mr. Edwards was different. He seemed genuinely curious, as though he saw her not just as the nurse caring for him, but as a person with her own story. "I've been here for a few weeks now, sir," Angela replied, carefully choosing her words. "It's been quite an experience so far." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, a subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I see," he said thoughtfully. "And how have you found the hospital? Does it live up to its reputation?" Angela hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. On one hand, she wanted to be honest about her experiences, about the discrimination and prejudice she had encountered. But on the other hand, she didn't want to reveal too much to a patient. She had learned the hard way that people often had preconceived notions about race and privilege, and she wasn't sure where Mr. Edwards stood. Still, there was something in his eyes, something that told her she could trust him. Angela took a deep breath, deciding to offer a more diplomatic response. "It's a beautiful hospital, Mr. Edwards," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "But like any place, it has its challenges." Mr. Edwards nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "I can imagine," he said softly. "I've seen a lot in my time, Nurse Parker. And I know that sometimes, the most difficult battles aren't fought in operating rooms or emergency departments. They're fought in places where people can't see what's happening beneath the surface." Angela was taken aback by his words. There was something about the way he spoke that hinted at a deeper understanding of the dynamics at play in St. Mary's, of the silent struggles that so many, especially people of color, faced every day. It was a stark contrast to the dismissive comments she had heard from her colleagues, the quiet exclusion she had been subjected to. For the first time in weeks, Angela felt as though someone truly understood the weight of her experience. Before she could respond, Dr. Greaves burst into the room with his usual over-the-top cheerfulness, his voice far too enthusiastic for the situation. "Mr. Edwards," he exclaimed, "I trust Nurse Parker has been taking good care of you. We only assign our best staff to our most distinguished patients." Angela's heart sank at the insincerity in Dr. Greaves' voice. She had heard him use similar lines with other patients, but this felt different. This felt like an attempt to use Mr. Edwards' status as a way to further demean her, to reinforce the idea that her work could never truly measure up to the standards of the hospital unless it was validated by a VIP patient. Mr. Edwards, however, wasn't fooled by Dr. Greaves' facade. His eyes flicked between the two of them, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Indeed, Dr. Greaves," he replied, his voice carrying an edge that Angela had not expected. "Nurse Parker has been exemplary. In fact, I was just asking her about her experiences here at St. Mary's. She seems to be a person of great skill and integrity." The subtle rebuke in Mr. Edwards' words wasn't lost on either of them. Dr. Greaves' smile faltered for a moment, and Angela couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. For the first time since arriving at St. Mary's, someone had stood up for her, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely recognized her worth. Mr. Edwards continued, his voice calm but firm. "I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand during my stay here," he said, his gaze never leaving Angela's face. Dr. Greaves quickly recovered his composure, launching into a detailed explanation of Mr. Edwards' treatment plan, but Angela could tell that the doctor's tone had shifted ever so slightly. He had been caught off guard, and there was an unspoken tension in the room now. It was clear that Mr. Edwards was not just any patient. He was a man of influence, someone who understood the dynamics of power and respect in ways that Angela had not anticipated. As Dr. Greaves continued to speak, Angela found herself reflecting on the interaction. She had never expected a patient, particularly one in such a vulnerable position, to stand up for her so forcefully. But in that moment, she realized that Mr. Edwards was not just a passive observer of her struggles, he was actively engaged, and his support could prove invaluable in the fight for change. Mr. Edwards as a catalyst for change. The days that followed Angela's first interaction with Mr. Edwards were like a turning point in her journey at St. Mary's General Hospital. She could feel the subtle shift in the air, as if the weight of the hospital's pervasive culture had been cracked open, letting in a small ray of light. It wasn't immediate or obvious, but Angela could sense that things were changing. She wasn't the only one noticing. The nurses who had once ignored her, the doctors who had brushed past her without a second glance, they all seemed to act a little differently now. There was still an undercurrent of resistance, but something had shifted, something Angela couldn't quite define yet. Mr. Edwards, despite being a patient, was no ordinary man. In their conversations, he had shared glimpses of his true identity, a man who had witnessed far more than just the daily grind of a hospital. He had seen corporate politics, power dynamics, and the way institutions perpetuated their biases, often disguised as tradition or protocol. Angela had known, deep down, that her fight for equality wasn't just about individual actions, it was about the system itself. But Mr. Edwards' words had illuminated a new path, a way forward that could reshape everything. In their private conversations, Mr. Edwards began to ask Angela more pointed questions about her experiences at the hospital. His inquiries weren't casual, they were intentional, probing the deeper truths of her struggle. He asked about the ways in which she felt excluded, the subtle comments she overheard, the difficult patients who targeted her with racial slurs. As she spoke, she felt an unexpected sense of validation. Mr. Edwards wasn't just listening, he was processing, understanding, and quietly absorbing everything she said. "You know," Mr. Edwards had said one day as Angela adjusted his fore, "sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that are never fought in a courtroom or on a battlefield. They're fought in the small, everyday moments, the microaggressions, the silent dismissals, the ways in which people are excluded simply because they don't fit the mold. Those are the battles that shape an institution. And those are the ones that are hardest to win." Angela had nodded, feeling the weight of his words. He understood. It wasn't just about the overt racism or the blatant exclusion. It was the small, seemingly insignificant acts that, when compounded over time, created an environment where people like her were made to feel less than, unworthy of respect, or undeserving of a seat at the table. As the days wore on, Angela found herself spending more time in Mr. Edwards' room. Despite his own injuries, he never hesitated to ask how she was doing, to check in on her mental and emotional state. He wasn't just a patient, he was an ally, someone who saw the value in Angela's work and who recognized the challenges she faced simply by existing in this space. It was a rare and precious gift, one that Angela didn't take for granted. But it wasn't just their personal conversations that gave Angela hope. It was Mr. Edwards' quiet observations and the way he seemed to understand exactly what needed to be done. He wasn't just a passive observer of the discrimination at St. Mary's, he was quietly compiling a strategy in his mind, a strategy that would eventually become the catalyst for change. One afternoon, as Angela was checking on Mr. Edwards, he mentioned something that made her heart skip a beat. "I've been in this hospital for a few days now," he said, his voice calm and measured, "and I've seen a lot. What's happening here, what you're dealing with, it's not right. It's a systemic issue, and it needs to be addressed. Not just for you, but for everyone who works here, who walks these halls, who gives everything to this place and is still treated like they don't belong." Angela had felt a surge of emotion at his words. She had known that the problems at St. Mary's weren't just isolated incidents. They were a part of a larger system that favored certain people over others, that created a hierarchy based on race and class and perpetuated the idea that only certain individuals were worthy of success. But hearing it from Mr. Edwards, hearing him acknowledge it in such a direct and powerful way, made her realize that this wasn't just a personal fight. It was a fight for justice, for fairness, for a new way of operating that would change the very foundation of St. Mary's. "I'm not saying this for my sake," Mr. Edwards continued. "I'm saying this because I know you have what it takes to change things. But you can't do it alone. You need people in positions of power who understand the stakes and who will stand with you." It was in that moment that Angela truly understood the gravity of Mr. Edwards' presence. He wasn't just a VIP patient getting special treatment, he was a man who had the power to move mountains, to challenge institutions, to make real and lasting change. And Angela, for the first time since she had walked through the doors of St. Mary's, felt that change was not just a distant dream, it was within reach. The next day, Angela found herself back in Mr. Edwards' room, her mind buzzing with new possibilities. As she entered, he looked up at her with a knowing smile, as though he had already anticipated what was coming. "I've been thinking," Mr. Edwards said. "You've been here long enough to know that what's happening in this hospital isn't right. But change doesn't come from the inside unless someone is brave enough to confront it. I think it's time to do something about it." Angela's heart raced as she realized what he was suggesting. It wasn't just about surviving in this environment, it was about taking action, about standing up for what was right and forcing the hospital to reckon with its own biases. Mr. Edwards was ready to use his influence, his power, to make St. Mary's accountable for its actions. "I'm not asking you to do it alone," Mr. Edwards continued. "But I will be with you every step of the way." For the first time in weeks, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just a personal battle anymore. This was a fight for the future of St. Mary's, a chance to create a hospital culture that truly lived up to its ideals of excellence, inclusion, and respect. With Mr. Edwards' support, Angela knew that they could force the hospital to face its own demons and finally confront the deep-seated prejudice that had long been allowed to fester beneath its shiny surface. Dr. Greaves' true nature revealed and the shift in power. The shift in power at St. Mary's General Hospital had begun, though it was still subtle, like a wave gathering momentum just below the surface, ready to crash. Angela had no idea how much of a role she was about to play in that transformation, but with Mr. Edwards' quiet but profound influence, things were moving faster than anyone could have anticipated. It wasn't just the changes in the way people treated her, though that was part of it, it was the recognition that the status quo, the deeply entrenched biases, and the discriminatory practices that had long been woven into the fabric of St. Mary's could no longer go unchecked. It was clear to Angela that the time for passive endurance was over. With Mr. Edwards' support, she had started to realize that she didn't just need to survive here, she needed to help transform it. But there was still one major obstacle standing in her way, one person who had embodied the worst of the institution's deeply ingrained prejudices, Dr. William Greaves. Dr. Greaves was everything that Angela had come to expect from the old guard elite of St. Mary's, arrogant, dismissive, and completely oblivious to the damage caused by his actions. He treated Angela like she was a novelty, a distraction from the real work that needed to be done. It wasn't just that he didn't respect her, it was that he saw her as a threat to the delicate balance of power that kept his world in place. If she succeeded, if she challenged the system that had kept people like him at the top, it would be an affront to everything he believed in. Angela's interactions with Dr. Greaves had been filled with condescension, thinly veiled insults, and an endless string of undermining comments. But it wasn't until she was thrust into a high-stakes situation that his true nature was fully revealed. The day of the emergency surgery was a pivotal moment, one that Angela would remember for the rest of her life. The hospital had been abuzz all morning with rumors of a high-profile operation involving a critically injured patient, a patient whose identity was so closely guarded that even the staff was kept in the dark. The whispers around the nurses' station grew louder as the hour approached. Everyone knew that something big was about to happen, and the hospital's entire hierarchy seemed to be on edge. Angela had been asked to assist in the surgery, a surprising but not altogether unwelcome request. It was an honor to be included in such a high-profile procedure, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Greaves, who would be leading the operation, was less concerned with the patient's welfare than with testing her under pressure. He had always found subtle ways to undermine her, and today would be no different. As she scrubbed in for the surgery, the tension in the room was palpable. She was surrounded by senior staff members, all of them watching her every move with a critical eye. The weight of their judgment felt suffocating. The operation itself was complicated, a delicate procedure with the potential for significant complications. Angela knew that she would need to be on top of her game, anticipating the surgeon's needs and providing support where necessary. But Dr. Greaves was not exactly the supportive leader one might hope for in such a high-pressure situation. As the surgery began, Angela noticed something that sent a jolt of alarm through her. Dr. Greaves, who was normally so confident in his work, was hesitating. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to make a critical incision. Angela's heart skipped a beat. In that split second, she realized that Dr. Greaves was about to make a mistake, one that could prove disastrous for the patient if not corrected. Without hesitation, Angela spoke up. "Dr. Greaves," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Perhaps we should consider approaching the incision from a different angle. The patient's anatomy suggests it might be safer." The room fell silent. Every eye in the operating theatre turned to her, the surgeons waiting for Dr. Greaves to respond. Angela's suggestion had been valid. She had been trained in these techniques, and her years of experience had given her the insight to make such a call. But Angela knew that speaking up could have consequences, especially with Dr. Greaves, who had never been one to tolerate challenges to his authority. For a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in Dr. Greaves' eyes. But then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Fine," he muttered, adjusting his approach. As the surgery continued, it became evident that Angela's suggestion had been correct. The angle she proposed allowed for a smoother and safer incision, one that significantly reduced the risk of complications. The patient's vitals remained stable, and the surgery was progressing well. Angela couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. She had been right. She had saved the patient's life, and she had proven that her skills were just as valuable, if not more so, than those of the senior doctors around her. But as the procedure wrapped up and the surgeons began to clean up, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Greaves had been holding back his frustration. His gaze was icy as he turned toward her, and she could see the anger in his eyes. He had been outmaneuvered, and it was something he could not tolerate. "Nurse Parker," Dr. Greaves said, his voice low and menacing as they left the operating room. "I need to see you in private." Immediately, Angela followed him into a private room, her heart pounding. She knew that this conversation wasn't going to be pleasant. Dr. Greaves' temper had always been just below the surface, but now she could sense the full extent of his anger. "You think you know better than me?" Dr. Greaves hissed, his face red with fury. "You think you can just waltz in here and challenge my authority, question my judgment in front of my team?" Angela stood tall, her back straight. "I was just doing my job, Dr. Greaves. The patient's safety was my priority. You're here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because of your skill or knowledge," Dr. Greaves continued, his voice rising. "People like you don't belong in a place like this. You don't belong in this hospital, and you certainly don't belong in my operating room." The words cut deep, but Angela didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, this wasn't new. What was new, however, was the calmness with which she faced him. She didn't need to shout back or fight him in the same way. She knew she had proven herself. Just as Angela was about to respond, a voice interrupted from the doorway. "Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards said, his voice low but firm, "I think you've forgotten where you are, and who you're speaking to." Angela turned in surprise, her eyes widening as she saw Mr. Edwards sitting upright in his bed, fully alert and watching the confrontation with intensity. His presence in the room was commanding, almost magnetic, and it was clear that he wasn't just a VIP patient. Dr. Greaves' expression faltered as he saw Mr. Edwards. "Mr. Edwards, I didn't realize you were awake," he stammered, his arrogance slipping. "I apologize for disturbing you." "Oh, I've been awake for quite some time, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards replied, his tone sharp. "Long enough to see the disgraceful way you've been treating Nurse Parker, and long enough to know that this behavior ends now." Angela felt a rush of relief, and a sense of empowerment flooded through her. Mr. Edwards had not only witnessed the way Dr. Greaves had treated her, but he had also been ready to intervene in a way that Angela could never have imagined. He wasn't just a passive observer in this fight, he was a powerful ally, and he was ready to stand with her. Mr. Edwards' intervention marked a turning point. It wasn't just Angela who had been wronged, it was the entire hospital system. The atmosphere had shifted, and it was clear that things would never be the same again. Dr. Greaves, once untouchable, was now on the defensive, his authority undermined by his own actions. As Mr. Edwards continued to speak, outlining the changes that would need to be made at St. Mary's, Angela felt a new sense of purpose rise within her. The fight for equality and fairness was no longer just her own, it was now a collective effort, one that would require everyone to take a hard look at their biases and prejudices. And with Mr. Edwards by her side, Angela knew that real change was finally within reach. The transformation begins and the reckoning at St. Mary's. The tension in the room was palpable as Mr. Edwards finished speaking. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, reverberating through every corner of the hospital. For Angela, it was as if the veil that had obscured the truth for so long had finally been lifted. The fight for equality, for justice, for a hospital that truly upheld its values of inclusivity and respect, it was no longer just an abstract hope. It was becoming a tangible reality. As Dr. Greaves stood frozen in shock, unable to respond to the unexpected intervention, Angela could feel the shift. It was not just a personal victory for her, it was a moment that represented something much larger, something much more profound. This wasn't just about her, or even about Dr. Greaves. It was about the institution itself. St. Mary's, with all its prestige and power, had been forced to confront its own shortcomings, its own deep-seated biases, and its own toxic culture. Mr. Edwards' presence in the room was undeniable. It wasn't just that he was a VIP patient, his authority and influence in the world of healthcare were vast, and now he was using that power to demand change. His words had struck a chord not only with Angela but with the entire institution. The notion that someone as high-ranking as Mr. Edwards was actively questioning the status quo was a wake-up call for everyone who had been complicit in allowing the system to perpetuate itself. Angela had fought hard to make it to this point, but she knew that this battle was far from over. There was still much to be done, much more than she had initially realized. But for the first time since walking through the doors of St. Mary's, she felt a sense of hope. The idea that this hospital, with all its flaws, could become a place where every patient and staff member was truly valued and respected was no longer just a dream. It was now a possibility, a path that Angela was determined to walk. In the days that followed, the hospital administration took swift action. Dr. Greaves was placed under investigation, and his behavior was scrutinized in light of the events that had transpired. The hospital leadership, once unwilling to acknowledge the systemic issues at play, was now forced to reckon with the reality that things had to change. Mr. Edwards, having seen enough, was instrumental in making sure that these changes would be more than just cosmetic. He demanded a full audit of the hospital's policies, with particular emphasis on its diversity and inclusion practices. The first step was the implementation of mandatory diversity training for all staff. It was a move that many nurses and doctors resisted at first, but Angela knew that this was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to simply check the box on diversity initiatives. They had to make real, meaningful changes in the way people interacted with one another, in how they treated their patients, and in how they saw the world. It was going to take time, but the seeds of change had been planted. As the weeks passed, Angela saw the transformation firsthand. The nurses who had once ignored her began to approach her, offering apologies for their behavior. Some even began to ask for her insight into the changes they were implementing. There were still moments of tension, still pockets of resistance, but they were no longer the dominant force. For the first time, Angela felt like she was a part of a real team, a team that was moving toward a common goal of equality and respect for all. But it wasn't just the staff that was changing. Angela also noticed a shift in the way patients were treated. It was as though a new atmosphere had been cultivated in the hospital, one where compassion and professionalism were the priority, where prejudice had no place. Patients who had previously expressed discomfort with Angela's presence now spoke to her with the same respect they showed any other nurse. It was a small but significant victory, a sign that things were truly changing. One of the most significant changes came when Angela was invited to join the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. It was a role she had never imagined for herself, but one that seemed to fit perfectly with her passion for making real, lasting change. The committee was tasked with overseeing the implementation of new hospital policies, including revised hiring practices, diversity initiatives, and anti-discrimination protocols. Angela's voice was now being heard at the highest levels of the hospital, and for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. The transformation at St. Mary's didn't happen overnight. It took time, effort, and a great deal of sacrifice. But through it all, Angela remained steadfast, supported by the strength of her family, the guidance of her mother's words, and the unexpected but invaluable support of Mr. Edwards. As the hospital began to evolve into a more inclusive and respectful institution, Angela realized that her fight was not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been overlooked, marginalized, and silenced. She was determined to make sure that no one else would have to endure the same challenges she had faced. Months later, as Angela stood in front of a packed auditorium at a national healthcare conference, speaking about her journey at St. Mary's, she felt a surge of pride. She had gone from being the isolated new nurse in a hostile environment to becoming a leader in the fight for equality and inclusion. The road had been long and filled with obstacles, but Angela knew that it had all been worth it. She was living proof that one voice, one person, could make a difference. As the applause echoed in the auditorium, Angela's thoughts turned to the future. There was still much work to be done, not just at St. Mary's but across the entire healthcare system. But with the changes already underway, Angela felt a sense of purpose that she had never known before. She wasn't just a nurse anymore, she was a changemaker, a leader in a movement that was beginning to transform the very nature of healthcare itself. The story of Angela Parker and Mr. Edwards had become more than just a tale of personal triumph. It was a story of how a single moment of courage and compassion could spark a revolution. And Angela knew that, together with others who shared her vision, they would continue to fight for a future where every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background, would be given the respect and dignity they deserved.